He goes under, and the water closes black over him. A few seconds pass. Then he breaks the surface, drags in one breath, and goes back down. Again. There is no light down there. He is working by feel, in cold, filthy water, his hands and his legs cut open on broken glass he cannot see. Each time he surfaces, he is carrying something, or someone, out of the dark. And each time, he turns around and goes back down. The people on the bank do not fully understand what they are watching. Neither did the country he was doing it for, because that country would spend the next 6 years insisting none of this ever happened. It happened on the 16th of September, 1976, on the edge of a Soviet city, at a reservoir the locals called Yerevan Lake. A trolleybus, an ordinary city trolleybus, the kind that runs on overhead wires and carries people home from work, lost control near the dam wall. It went over the edge and into the water. There were somewhere around 92 people on board. It sank about 25 meters from shore and settled on the bottom, roughly 10 meters down, in silt and sewage-fouled water, with the people still inside. The man in the water was named Shavarsh Karapetyan. He was 23, and he happened to be finishing a training run along the lake with his brother when it went in. That detail matters more than it sounds, and we'll come back to it. What matters first is what the Soviet state did next. Because in the system Karapetyan lived under, a city bus full of citizens drowning was not, first and foremost, a tragedy. It was something worse. It was an admission. A state-run vehicle carrying ordinary Soviet people, failing and sinking and killing them. That was proof the system had failed. And the system's first instinct, faced with proof it had failed, was not to mourn. It was to make the proof disappear. As Karapetyan himself put it, years later. In the Soviet Union, trolleybuses were not supposed to fall into the water. So the silence that followed was not an oversight. It was a reflex. And to understand it, you have to look at how, exactly, you make an event this size unhappen. You start by saying almost nothing. In the days after, the local Armenian party paper, Communist, ran the story in 3 short notices. Together they came to fewer than 100 words. None of them named the man who had gone into the water. There was no front page. There was no headline about a rescue. There was a near silence, printed small, and then nothing. The photographs that were taken, and there were photographs, did not run either. By most accounts, they sat at the district attorney's office and were not published for around 2 years. And then there was the counting. According to a classified party report, the kind of internal document the public was never meant to see, the dead were tallied. That report reportedly put the number at 46. Here is the detail worth sitting with. A government careful enough to count its dead in a sealed file knew exactly what had happened at that reservoir. It simply decided the public would not. This is also where the record itself starts to come apart. How many did Karapetyan personally pull from the water? Depending on the source, the answer is 30, or 35, or 37. And in his own later account, more still. The one number nobody disputes is the cruelest one. Of all the people recovered from that bus, only 20 survived. Those numbers don't agree with each other, and that disagreement is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. When a state refuses to keep an honest public record, the record splinters. And decades later, you are left with 3 different counts and a sealed file, all because the machine could not afford to say a single true sentence out loud. It was the same reflex that, a decade later, would keep the world from hearing about Chernobyl for days. Not a single villain's order. A standing instinct to protect the image of a system that could not be seen to fail. So the silence held. For 6 years, the public record of what happened at Yerevan Lake amounted to a few lines, no name, and no rescue at all. Until a reporter, not a rescuer, a reporter, decided that was not acceptable. The silence finally broke in the autumn of 1982. It broke because a journalist heard the story and realized it had never properly been told. His name was Sergei Leskov, and he printed it in the national paper Komsomolskaya Pravda on the 12th of October, 1982. It did not stop there. Around the same time, a second reporter, Gennady Bocharov, in the literary press, told the same story to the same country. Two journalists, independently, deciding the silence was no longer acceptable. And this time, it caught. Readers wrote in by the tens of thousands. 6 years after the fact, the country was finally allowed to read what had happened. And even then, even in the article that broke the silence, there was not one word about how many people had died. The exposé that corrected the cover-up still carried the cover-up inside it. The reflex was so deep that even the man breaking it could only break part of it, which leaves the question this whole story turns on. Why? Why, 6 years later, with the story finally in print, was the death toll still the one thing that could not be said? To answer that, you have to understand what was actually being hidden, and what it cost the man who made it impossible to ignore. The reason he could go into that water at all was an accident of timing. He was a finswimmer, trained to hold his breath and move underwater on a single lungful, which is why he could keep going back down when almost no one else could have. That was the extent of his advantage. It did not make the water cleaner, or the glass less sharp, or his body able to take what came next. He went down by the strictest accounts around 20 times, each dive lasting about 25 seconds. The hardest part, he said, was breaking the rear window to get inside. He kicked it out with his legs. The pain was unbearable, he recalled. Of course I was hurt by the glass, but I did not think about it. I understood there was little time. The water did the rest. It was contaminated, and the glass had opened him up. And within days, he had pneumonia and blood poisoning. His fever ran to around 40 degrees. He spent something like 45 days in a hospital bed, while his lungs failed around him. They never fully recovered. The injuries ended his career. And then he did something that tells you everything about him. Months later, lungs scarred, he returned for one final meet and set one last world record on the ruined lungs the rescue had left him. It was not a victory lap. It was the last thing those lungs would ever do. But for all of that, he did not save everyone. And he never let himself forget it. On one of those dives, near the end, running out of oxygen and beginning to lose consciousness, he grabbed what he thought was a person and pulled it to the surface. It was a seat cushion from the bus. In his own words, he was in a borderline conscious state, and he did not realize it was not a human being he had pulled out. Later, he did the math on it without mercy. That mistake, he believed, cost a life. He should have, he said, taken 5 breaths instead of the ones he took. This is not a legend. This is a man who broke his own body for strangers and then carried, for the rest of his life, the weight of the one he didn't reach. which makes what the state did next harder, not easier, to understand. Because this man broke himself in the dark for people he had never met. So why was his name still the thing the record kept leaving out? Here is the answer, and it is the part nobody tells you. The state was not hiding a hero. It was hiding an accident. And the hero was the problem precisely because he was the proof the accident had happened. Think about what celebrating Karapetyan would have required. To call him a hero in public, with a medal and a headline, the state would have had to explain what he was a hero of. It would have had to say out loud that a Soviet city trolleybus full of Soviet citizens had gone off a dam and drowned dozens of them in a municipal reservoir. The rescue and the disaster were the same sentence. You could not admit one without admitting the other. The machine that could not say, a trolleybus full of people sank, also could not say, one man pulled them out, because the second sentence proves the first. That is why it was never two cover-ups, an accident buried and a hero buried beside it. It was one cover-up, and he was inside it. His greatness was not something the state happened to overlook. His greatness was the evidence, and so it had to vanish with everything else. And that is why, even in 1982, even in the article that finally told the story, the death toll still could not appear. Because the number of dead was the disaster itself, stated plainly. And that was the one thing the system was never able to say. He never received the highest honor, hero of the Soviet Union. The country that turned its heroism into a religion could not afford to canonize this one, because his miracle came with a receipt. In the end, the state gave him a lesser award, the Order of the Badge of Honor. Not the title a deed like that should have carried. A smaller thing, quietly given, that never required anyone to explain the water. And the record does not stop there. 3 years later, in February of 1985, a fire broke out at a large sports and concert complex in Yerevan. Karapetyan was nearby again, and he ran in again, toward the fire, to help fight it and save the building. And he was badly burned doing it, and he spent a long time in a hospital again. The same instinct, a second time, with a body that had already paid once. There is an asteroid that carries his name. There is, decades later, a moment where he carried an Olympic torch through a crowd that finally knew who he was. And there is this. Shavarsh Karapetyan is still alive. He outlived the Soviet Union that tried to erase him by more than 30 years. The machine made the rescue disappear. It made the number disappear. It very nearly made the man disappear too. But it couldn't. It buried the file. It did not bury him, which leaves one quiet, uncomfortable question. A state that could keep a rescue this large off the record for 6 years, and very nearly forever, was a state with the machinery to do it again. So how many other files like this one are still closed? How many events were counted in a sealed report and never entered into anything the public was allowed to read? That is what a cold file is. Not a story that was lost. A story that was filed away, on purpose, by someone who counted the dead and decided you would not.